Ordering numbers that involve absolute value. Here we're going to combine a couple of the different things that we have done in the last couple of days. So we're going to work with absolute value, and we're also going to work with a number line and putting numbers in order from least to greatest. Remember, when you work with negative numbers, the larger the digit, the less it is worth. If you have trouble with working with those negative numbers, you can always plot them on a number line. So here it says, when ordering a set of numbers that contain absolute value, you must order them after the absolute values are simplified. Please write your answers with the absolute value symbols. And I tend to sometimes make the mistake of writing it with that absolute value in my final answer. So we need to make sure that we remember to do this last part. So when we go through to do this, we're going to start by simplifying wherever we have absolute values. So the numbers we have right now are 8, the absolute value of 3, -5, the absolute value of -2, and -2. So we're going to start by simplifying these two. And I'm just going to write my answers right above them. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. So when I'm going to compare, I'm now going to think of this number, not this number. Okay, so on this one, the absolute value of -2 is 2 places away from 0. Okay, so once again, when I go to order them, I'm going to have to look at this number here when I put them in order. So now I'm going to kind of cross these off just right now, just so that it doesn't look quite so confusing and I don't have so much to look at. Okay, so the numbers that I have are 8, 3, those are positive, 2 is positive, and then I have these two negatives. Now, I like to identify my positives and my negatives and kind of keep them separate and work as 2 separate chunks. So now I'm comfortable with positive numbers. I'm going to go ahead and do those negative numbers. Those of you that struggle with negative numbers, you could plot on your number line if you needed to and just plot them. So like this would be -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So that's where -5 would be. -2 would fall right here. So if you need to do that, you can. Most of you probably won't have to do that. So now if I go through and I plot my other numbers, well, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8's going to be sitting out here. 3 would be right here. So really, I'm going to write the absolute value of 3 because remember, I have to remember to do this step that I tend to forget. And then this one right here was the absolute value of -2, but the answer was 2, so 2 would fall here. This is the absolute value of 2. So when I go through to write my answer, I can now work from left to right, and they're already put in order. Some of you will be able to do it without plotting it, but some of you that need that visual, you may need to plot it on a number line until you get comfortable with the process. So when I put these in order, my order is -5 is the smallest, then -2. Next would come the absolute value of 2, then the absolute value of 3, and finally 8. So this is my final answer for putting them in order. Okay, it's kind of tricky when you're converting it out of absolute value, but then having to write your answer in absolute value. That's kind of where this visual helps me remember to do that, but you don't have to do that. Okay, so let's try another one. So we're going to start where we have absolute values. So here's an absolute value bar, and here's an absolute value bar. So I'm going to simplify those first. So the absolute value of -6, well, that's 6 places away from 0. And the absolute value of 5 is 5 places away from 0. Okay, so now I'm done looking at this for now. I'm going to leave it there so it just reminds me I need to do the absolute value. So now I'm comparing. It looks like I've got these two that are negative. Those negatives always trip me up. So negatives. Also, that negative sign can be like the opposite. So if I think of when I'm just looking at my negative numbers, think the opposite of what you would normally do. like with a whole number. So opposite, well, normally this would be the biggest if it was a whole number, like without the negative sign. So I have to think the opposite. That means it's going to be the smallest. So it's going to be -7, then -6. Okay, I'm done with these two. Now I'm working with the rest of them all have a positive answer. So I've got, for the numbers that I'm looking for my positives, I have this 5, this 8, and this 6. And I'm pretty good with positive numbers, right? I hope so. I've been teaching math for a while. So when I go through and I do this, I would do 5, then 6, then 8. But I have to remember, I have to write it out with the absolute value bar. So instead of writing 5, I'm going to write the absolute value of 5. Then the absolute value of, this was, I believe, a negative, right? Yep. -6. And then 8. So that would be my final answer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put the next two out for you to go ahead and work on your own. And if you'd like to pause the video because you need extra time, go ahead and pause the video because I won't wait a super long time, but you can always pause the video if you need more time to be able to sort through all of your problems. Okay, so when I look at this, I'm going to start with these. Okay, so I've got those transformed. Now I'm going to go ahead and work with my positive versus negative. So here I've got negative and a negative. I always like to start with those because those are the ones that tend to trip people up the most. So this negative sign, I can also think of opposite. So the opposite of what I would normally think. Well, when I normally think of 12 versus 15, I would say 15 is the larger one. Since these are both negatives, I'm going to think the opposite. So -15 would be the smallest, then -12. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at these positive numbers. So 10 would come next. Now that was written out as the absolute value of 10. And then 12 would come next, and that was written out as the absolute value of -12. And then my final one would be 26, and that was the absolute value of -26. I know, it looks kind of tricky because you're thinking that all of those negatives should be over on the left-hand side. So you just have to remember that you have to simplify your absolute value first. Okay, so on this one, I only have one negative to worry about, so that's pretty easy. And of my positives, I would go 11, 20, 21, 34. So 11 was really the absolute value of -11. And 20 was the absolute value of 20. And 21 was just 21, so no absolute value symbol there. And 34 was actually the absolute value of -34. All right, so take note that everything that we were working on in this lesson was building upon each other. So the key thing is that you're focusing on making sure that you're understanding